Hello, my friends. I hope you are finding peace in your day. Perhaps sitting by a window watching the world move past while you hold a warm cup in your hands. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt the universe was trying to tell you something through the smallest, most unexpected gesture? We humans often believe that important messages arrive with fanfare, with clear explanations, with certainty. But sometimes the most life-changing moments arrive on four paws, carrying a weathered old shoe. In the quiet countryside, a war veteran named John spends his days on a weathered porch, keeping the world at arm's length. His only companion is an aging golden retriever who has watched his master grow more distant with each passing year. But one autumn evening, a scruffy stray dog appears from the shadows. In his mouth is an old brown leather shoe, worn, forgotten, abandoned. The dog places it at John's feet and waits. He does not beg for food. He does not seek shelter. He simply looks up with eyes that seem to understand something John has long forgotten. What would you do if a forgotten object suddenly felt like a message? Would you dismiss it as coincidence? Or would you consider that perhaps, just perhaps, the universe was offering you exactly what you needed most? This is a story about two souls connected by loss, a mysterious journey of a single shoe, and the four-legged messenger who refused to let the past remain buried. Before we begin, I invite you to click the subscribe button to join our community of listeners who believe in the healing power of unexpected connections. Now, let us walk onto that weathered porch. Hello, my friends. I hope this moment finds you well, perhaps settled comfortably while autumn leaves drift past your window. It is strange, isn't it? How we spend so much of our lives building walls to protect ourselves from pain. We close our doors, we avoid vulnerability, and we tell ourselves that isolation is safety. But sometimes life has a way of slipping through those cracks we thought were sealed. Sometimes the most important visitors are the ones we never invited, arriving to remind us that healing often wears a coat of fur and carries gifts we don't yet understand. I want to tell you a story today about a man who had convinced himself that solitude was survival, and the scruffy messenger who taught him that the heart is strongest when it remains open, even when it's been broken. The autumn air usually arrived first in the countryside, carrying the scent of turning leaves and distant wood smoke long before the evening settled into true darkness. For John, a veteran in his late 70s, the cooling air was not unwelcome, but simply another marker of time passing. Another season, another year, another day that felt much like the one before. He sat in his weathered rocking chair on the porch, a crocheted blanket draped across his knees despite his protests to anyone who might suggest he needed it. The wooden boards beneath him were worn smooth from decades of use, grooved by the arc of his chair and the patient patting of Rusty's paws. Rusty, his golden retriever, lay beside him, the dog's graying muzzle resting on crossed paws, his breathing slow and rhythmic. At 78 years old, John's body was a ledger of sacrifice written in scars and stiffness. He was still a tall man, though age had bent his spine slightly forward, giving him the appearance of someone leaning perpetually into an unseen wind. The cane resting against his chair, polished oak with a brass handle worn smooth by his grip, was a necessity now, though he had resisted it for years. His hair, which had once been a rich chestnut brown, now fell in thin, silver waves that he kept trimmed but never styled. The deep lines around his eyes spoke not of laughter but of squinting into distant horizons, looking for threats that never stopped coming even after the war ended. He lifted a chipped ceramic mug to his lips, taking a slow sip of tea that had long since gone lukewarm. He didn't mind. Warmth was less important than routine. Each morning he woke at dawn, made his tea, took his walk through the quiet streets with Rusty trailing faithfully behind, returned home and settled onto this porch. Each afternoon he sat. Each evening he watched the sun fade. The routine was armor, kept questions at bay, kept neighbors from lingering too long, kept memories locked in their cages. The porch itself was an extension of John's philosophy, functional but unwelcoming. The gray paint was peeling in long strips like old skin. The railing wobbled when touched. The hanging flower basket that once held his late wife's geraniums now held only brittle, brown stems he couldn't bring himself to remove or revive. It was a porch that said, "I am here, but do not ask me to be more than present." Rusty lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked forward. His tail gave a single, uncertain thump against the floorboards. John followed the dog's gaze toward the hedgerow that marked the edge of his property. The bushes rustled with movement, too large for a squirrel, too deliberate for the wind. John's hand instinctively tightened on his cane, old instincts from another life flaring to attention. His eyes narrowed, scanning the darkening foliage for the source of the disturbance. For a long moment, nothing. Just the whisper of leaves and the distant call of a crow settling into the oaks. Then, from the shadows between the hedges, a dog emerged. It was not Rusty's size or breed, nor was it the well-groomed pet of a neighbor. This was a stray, no question about it. The animal was medium-sized, its coat a patchwork of matted brown and gray fur that hung in clumps, revealing patches of dirt-streaked skin beneath. Its ribs were visible through the thin layer of muscle, each one clearly defined like keys on a xylophone. The dog's ears were alert but lowered, its posture submissive yet cautious, the stance of an animal that had learned the hard way to approach the world with suspicion. But it was not the dog's appearance that caught John's attention. It was what the dog carried in its mouth. Clenched gently but firmly between its jaws was a shoe, an old brown leather shoe. The dog moved with deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness across the yard. It did not run or dart. It walked, head lowered, eyes locked on John, as if making an offering to a king. Rusty watched but did not rise, did not bark, did not challenge the stranger. The golden retriever simply observed with what could only be described as understanding. The stray reached the base of the porch steps. It paused, looking up at John with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed far too knowing for an animal. Then, with great care, the dog climbed the 3 wooden steps, each footfall deliberate and measured. When it reached the top, it walked directly to John's feet, lowered its head, and placed the brown shoe on the weathered floorboards. Not dropped, placed. The dog stepped back 2 paces and sat. It did not beg. It did not whine. It simply waited, watching John with an intensity that was unnerving in its focus. John stared at the shoe lying at his feet. It was old, very old. The brown leather was cracked and faded, dulled by time and exposure to the elements. The laces were still threaded through the eyelets but frayed at the ends, the aglets long since disappeared. The sole was worn nearly smooth in the center, evidence of thousands of miles walked. Mud was caked in the seams, but beneath the dirt, John could see the quality of the craftsmanship. This had been a good shoe once, a soldier's shoe, a working man's shoe, a shoe that had traveled far and carried someone through difficult ground. John leaned forward slowly, his joints protesting with small pops and creaks. He set his mug aside and reached down, his weathered fingers wrapping around the shoe. It was heavier than he expected, not from the material but from the weight of something intangible that clung to it, history, perhaps, or memory. He lifted it, turning it over in his hands. The leather was cold, dry, brittle in places where age had stolen its flexibility. On the heel, he noticed faint indentations, pressure marks from the dog's careful grip. Not the tearing gouges of a scavenger playing with trash, but the gentle, precise hold of an animal carrying something precious. The shoe smelled of earth and rain and something else beneath it all. A faint trace of leather oil, applied long ago by hands that cared for their possessions. John looked up at the dog. The stray had not moved. It sat perfectly still, its eyes locked on John's face, waiting for something. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or understanding. The air between them felt charged, as if this was not merely a dog dropping off garbage but something more significant. Something that required a response John didn't yet know how to give. "Where did you get this?" John asked, his voice rough and cracking from disuse. He spoke more to himself than the dog, but the animal's ears twitched at the sound. The question hung in the cooling air, unanswered. The dog tilted its head slightly, then looked toward the road that led out of town, then back at John. The gesture was almost human in its clarity. "I brought this from out there, from somewhere else, from someone else." A small gust of wind rattled the brittle stems in the hanging basket, and John became aware of how rapidly the daylight was fading. The sun had dipped below the treeline, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. In the growing darkness, the stray dog's eyes seemed to glow with reflected light, twin embers of determination and something that looked unsettlingly like hope. John set the shoe down beside his chair, his mind churning through possibilities. A stray scavenging through someone's trash? Possible, but the shoe had been carried with too much care. A lost item from a hiker? The nearest trail was miles away, and no hiker would lose only one shoe. Someone's discarded belonging? Then why would the dog bring it here, to this porch, to this particular man? He looked again at the dog. The animal was shivering now, whether from cold or exhaustion or something else. John couldn't tell. Its ribs heaved with each breath. His paws were scraped and raw. This was not the casual journey of a dog wandering through a neighborhood. This was the journey of a creature on a mission, driven by something John couldn't name but could feel in his bones. A recognition, one soldier to another, that the mission is not complete until the message is delivered. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" John whispered. The dog's tail swept once across the porch floor. A confirmation, an acknowledgement, a plea. John looked down at the brown leather shoe sitting beside his chair, then at the scruffy, determined messenger who had placed it there, and felt something shift in his chest. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Not quite curiosity, not quite concern, but something more dangerous than either. It was the first stirring of purpose. The first crack in the walls he had built so carefully around his heart. The first recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, this forgotten shoe and this stray dog were not coincidences but something the universe had delivered to his doorstep because it knew what he had spent decades trying to deny. He was not ready to be done. He was not ready to sit alone on this porch until the final darkness came. He was not ready to let the world remain locked out. And this dog, with its knowing eyes and its careful burden, had just given him a reason to open the door. The morning began the way every morning had begun for the past 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days. Not that John was counting. The numbers simply existed in his mind the way shadows exist beneath trees, unavoidable and unremarkable. He woke at 5:45 without the aid of an alarm clock, his internal rhythm calibrated to decades of military precision that age and retirement had failed to dismantle. The bedroom was gray with pre-dawn light filtering through curtains he never fully closed, a compromise between the dark and the intrusion of daylight that suited his current relationship with the world. Present but not participating. He sat on the edge of his bed for 3 full minutes before attempting to stand, allowing his joints to remember their function. His knees ached with the particular throb that predicted rain, a forecast more reliable than any weatherman. The cane leaning against his nightstand was no longer optional, though he had spent 2 stubborn years pretending otherwise. His left hip, shattered in an ambush 47 years ago and rebuilt with pins and prayers, required the steady pressure of oak and brass to bear the weight of a body that had survived longer than it had any right to expect. He dressed in the same rotation of clothing he had maintained since Ellen passed. 3 pairs of khaki work pants, for plaid button-down shirts, a cardigan the color of dried moss that she had knitted in the final winter before the cancer took her voice and then her breath. He wore the cardigan every day now, regardless of temperature, the fabric thin and pilled but still carrying the ghost of her scent if he concentrated hard enough in the quiet moments between thoughts. On his feet went the same leather boots he had resoled 4 times, their laces knotted and reknotted into a permanent arrangement that no longer required tying. The house smelled of yesterday's toast and the particular mustiness of rooms where windows were opened only for practical necessity, never for pleasure. The living room held furniture arranged with military precision. A recliner facing the television that was rarely turned on, a coffee table stacked with unread newspapers still in their plastic sleeves, and framed photographs on the mantel that he both could not bear to look at and could not bear to put away. Ellen on their wedding day, her smile impossibly wide. Ellen holding their daughter Sarah on the porch of their first house. Sarah in her college graduation gown. Sarah's wedding. And then no more photographs, because Sarah had moved to California 15 years ago, and the distance between them was measured not in miles but in silences that had calcified into permanent separation. Rusty waited by the back door, his tail giving a single polite thump when John entered the kitchen. The golden retriever was 12 years old now, gray around the muzzle and slow in his movements, a mirror of John's own aging. They had grown old together in this house, two bachelors nursing wounds that time had softened but never healed. John filled Rusty's bowl with kibble and refreshed his water, then put the kettle on for tea. Coffee had been Ellen's drink. Tea was his own, a small reclamation of identity in a life that had become defined by absence. While the water heated, John stood at the kitchen window and watched the world wake up. The Hendersons' porch light clicked off across the street, right on schedule. Mr. Martinez walked past with his terrier, the same route at the same time as always. The newspaper delivery truck crept down the road, its brake lights flaring at each driveway. John's paper landed with a soft thump against his mailbox. He would retrieve it later, add it to the stack, tell himself he would read them this weekend, though he knew he would not. The kettle whistled. John prepared his tea with the same ritualized precision he applied to everything. 1 bag of English breakfast, steeped for exactly 3 minutes, a splash of milk, no sugar. He carried the steaming mug to the front door, Rusty padding faithfully behind him, and together they stepped onto the porch. This was the throne from which John observed his kingdom of solitude. The porch wrapped around the front and eastern side of his small craftsman-style home, its gray paint peeling in long strips that revealed the bone-white primer beneath. The floorboards were worn smooth in paths that marked his movements over decades. From door to rocking chair, from rocking chair to railing, from railing back to door. A hanging basket that had once overflowed with Ellen's geraniums now held only the brittle, brown skeletons of stems he could neither revive nor remove. The rocking chair itself was a relic from Ellen's grandmother, its spindles loose, its cushion faded to an indeterminate color somewhere between blue and gray. John lowered himself into the chair with the careful choreography of a man whose body required negotiation rather than command. Rusty settled at his feet, chin resting on paws, his breathing already slowing towards sleep. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass from Mr. Martinez's obsessive lawn care and the distant smell of bacon from the Hendersons' kitchen. John wrapped both hands around his mug and watched the neighborhood perform its morning rituals. Mrs. Chun walked past at 6:20, her power-walking pace unchanged after 20 years in the same sensible white sneakers. She waved. John lifted one hand in acknowledgement. She did not stop. This was their arrangement, comfortable in its lack of demand. At 6:30, the school bus rumbled past, half empty now that so many families had moved away or grown old in place. John remembered when Sarah used to wait at that corner, her backpack too large for her small frame, turning to wave at him every morning until the day she decided she was too old for such childish gestures. By 7 o'clock, the neighborhood had emptied of those with jobs to reach and lives to live. John sat alone with his tea, now lukewarm, watching the leaves on the oak tree shift in the breeze. His phone rang inside the house. He could hear its muffled trill through the window. He did not move to answer it. It would be the community center asking if he would volunteer at the veterans' breakfast, or the library inquiring about the 3 books he had checked out 4 months ago and never read, or possibly Sarah calling from California with the strained politeness that characterized their quarterly conversations. He would listen to the voicemail later. Maybe, probably not. The morning stretched into afternoon through a series of small, unremarkable transitions. John walked to the mailbox, retrieved the newspaper he would not read, waved to Mr. Henderson, who was trimming his hedge with geometric precision. He walked the perimeter of his property with Rusty, a journey that took 15 minutes and covered the same ground they had covered every day for 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days. The grass needed mowing. He would do it tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. Lunch was a sandwich eaten standing at the kitchen counter. 2 slices of wheat bread, deli turkey that was approaching its expiration date, a slice of American cheese, mustard. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing, washing it down with water from a glass that still bore Ellen's lipstick print on the rim, faded to a ghost but never washed away. Rusty received a piece of turkey crust. This was their communion. The afternoon found John back on the porch, This time with a book he pretended to read while his eyes tracked the same paragraph again and again without comprehension. The mailman came and went. Mrs. Chun returned from whatever errands occupied her mornings. Walking slower now, her face flushed with exertion. The Henderson children arrived home from school, their voices high and bright with the particular joy of Friday afternoon freedom. John closed his book and simply watched, a spectator in the theater of other people's lives. The sun tracked its predictable arc across the sky, and John tracked its progress with the attention of a man who had nothing else demanding his time. He noted the precise moment when the shadow of the oak tree touched the base of his porch steps. 3:47, same as yesterday, same as the day before. He watched the light change from white to gold to the deeper amber that preceded evening. Rusty slept and woke and slept again, his dreams punctuated by small whimpers and the twitching of paws chasing rabbits that had long since escaped. Somewhere around 5:30, John considered going inside to prepare dinner. Another sandwich, perhaps, or the leftover chicken he had baked 3 days ago and been steadily consuming in joyless increments. But the evening was pleasant, and the chair was comfortable, and the effort of rising seemed suddenly overwhelming. He would sit for 5 more minutes, then 10, then another 10 after that. It was in this settling dusk, in this moment of transition between day and the coming night, that Rusty lifted his head. The dog's ears pricked forward with sudden attention, his body tensing with an alertness John had not seen in months. A low, uncertain sound rumbled in Rusty's chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, but something between warning and curiosity. John followed the dog's gaze toward the hedgerow that marked the boundary of his property. The bushes moved with purpose, branches parting and swaying in a pattern too deliberate for wind. Something was there. Something was moving through the tangle of forsythia and wild rose, pushing through the undergrowth with determination. John's hand tightened on the arm of his chair, ancient instincts flaring to life beneath decades of domesticated rust. His heart rate increased slightly. His breathing shallowed. He waited, watching the bushes, while Rusty stood and moved to the top of the porch steps, his tail uncertain, his posture alert. The world held its breath. The evening birds paused in their songs. The breeze stilled, and John sat in his rocking chair, tea long cold in the mug beside him, watching the hedgerow shake with the approach of something that would change everything, though he did not yet know it. The rustling grew closer. A shape began to emerge from the shadows between the branches, darker than the gathering dusk, moving with purpose toward the weathered porch where a lonely veteran sat waiting for a visitor he had not invited and could not have imagined. The dog that emerged from the forsythia was not the well-groomed pet of a neighbor who had wandered off course. This was something else entirely, something that belonged more to the wild spaces than to the manicured lawns of suburban comfort. It was medium-sized, perhaps 40 pounds, though it was difficult to tell beneath the matted coat of fur that hung in clumps and tangles like storm-damaged thatch. The coat was a patchwork of browns and grays, dirt-streaked and burr-studded, speaking of weeks or perhaps months spent navigating thorns and underbrush without the gentle hand of human care. The animal's ribs pressed visibly against its skin, each bone distinct and countable even from a distance. Its legs were thin, the joints prominent, the paws scraped and raw from hard miles on rough ground. But it was the dog's eyes that caught John's attention and held it with uncomfortable intensity. They were dark and round, set deep in a narrow face marked by scars. A torn ear, a patch of missing fur along the jaw where some past violence had left its signature. The eyes carried an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth, and within that intelligence burned something John recognized because he had seen it in mirrors on particularly difficult mornings. The look of a soul that had been broken and had continued living anyway. Rusty's uncertain rumble ceased. The golden retriever descended 1 step, 2, his tail beginning a slow, cautious wag. Whatever threat assessment he had been conducting had concluded in favor of curiosity rather than alarm. The stray dog paused at the base of the porch steps, its attention divided between Rusty's gentle approach and something it carried clenched carefully in its jaws. It was a shoe. The stray climbed the 3 wooden steps with deliberate precision, each placement of its paws measured and careful, the way one might cross a frozen river when uncertain of the ice. Rusty touched noses with the newcomer in that brief ritual of canine greeting, a moment of communication that required no translation. Some accord was reached, some understanding passed between them that John could not interpret but could only witness. The stray dog walked directly to John's chair, ignoring the empty food bowl Rusty had abandoned hours ago, ignoring the water dish still half full near the railing, ignoring everything except its apparent mission. When it reached John's feet, it lowered its head with a solemnity that bordered on ceremonial and placed the shoe on the weathered floorboards between John's worn leather boots. Not dropped, not released with the casual disregard of a dog abandoning a stick or a stolen sandwich. Placed, set down with intention and care, positioned with the heel toward John and the toe pointing away, as if the shoe's orientation mattered, as if this was an offering that required proper presentation. The dog stepped back 2 measured paces and sat. It did not pant despite the exertion that had clearly brought it here. It did not whine or bark or make any sound at all. It simply sat, its dark eyes locked on John's face, waiting for something, acknowledgement, perhaps, or understanding, or action of some kind that John did not yet comprehend. John stared at the shoe. The world had narrowed to this single object lying on his porch, this inexplicable gift delivered by an inexplicable messenger. His hands remained gripped on the arms of his chair, his body still frozen in the half-rise of alarm that Rusty's warning had triggered. His mind cycled through possibilities and found each one insufficient to explain what his eyes were showing him. The shoe was old, not just worn, but genuinely old. Its leather cracked and faded to the point where its original color could only be guessed at, brown, perhaps, or tan, now weathered to something between rust and dust. The laces were still threaded through the eyelets but frayed at the ends where the aglets had long since disappeared, leaving only unraveling threads. The sole was worn nearly smooth at the heel and toe, the tread pattern erased by thousands of miles of contact with concrete and dirt and gravel. John leaned forward slowly, his cane forgotten against the chair, his tea forgotten beside him. He reached down with both hands and picked up the shoe, lifting it with the same careful reverence one might use to handle a religious artifact or a piece of unexploded ordnance, something that demanded respect not for what it was but for what it might mean. The leather was cold in his hands, stiffened by exposure and age, the surface rough like tree bark in places where the finish had cracked away. He turned it over, examining the sole, and saw the pattern of wear that spoke to a specific human gait. Heavy on the outside of the heel, rolling inward toward the ball of the foot. A man's walk, a working man's walk, someone who had spent long days on his feet, moving with purpose across hard ground. The laces, though frayed, were tied in a particular knot. Not the standard bow that most people learned in childhood, but a square knot reinforced with a half-hitch, the kind of knot a soldier might tie, the kind that would not come undone without deliberate effort. John's fingers found the knot and held it, feeling the texture of the age-weakened cotton, and something stirred in his memory like silt disturbed at the bottom of a long, still pond. He brought the shoe closer to his face, studying the construction. This had been quality footwear once, the kind built to last rather than to impress. The leather was full grain, thick and substantial even in its deteriorated state. The stitching, though broken in places, had been done with care, small, even stitches that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when such things mattered. Someone had valued this shoe. Someone had maintained it, resold it perhaps more than once, applied leather oil to preserve it, kept it in service long past the point when most people would have declared it ready for the trash. John's thumb traced the outline of something embossed on the inner tongue of the shoe, letters worn nearly smooth but still discernible if you knew they were there and looked for them at the right angle in the fading light. U.S. United States. Military issue. Not recent, the style was wrong for that, the construction old-fashioned, but unmistakably military in origin. The shoe smelled of earth and rain and something else beneath those immediate scents, something that took John back through decades to barracks and transport trucks, and the particular smell of leather that had absorbed years of sweat and effort and fear and determination. This shoe had been to war. Maybe not the same war John had known, but some war, some conflict that had required men to walk long miles through hostile territory with nothing but boots on their feet and faith in their training and luck. John looked up from the shoe to the dog still sitting before him, still watching with those dark, knowing eyes. The animal's body trembled slightly, whether from exhaustion or cold or something else. John could not tell. Dust and bits of dried leaves clung to its matted fur. Its paws were bleeding slightly, small dots of red that stained the gray wood of the porch floor. "Where did you get this?" John asked, his voice emerging rough and cracked from hours of disuse. The word surprised him. He had not spoken aloud to anything except Rusty in 3 days, and even those conversations were typically one-sided commentary that required no response. The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound of John's voice, but it did not bark or whine in answer. It simply continued to watch, its gaze steady and patient, and waited with a communication that transcended language. John looked down at the shoe again, turning it in his hands, feeling the weight of it physically and metaphorically. This was not garbage. This was not some random piece of refuse that a scavenging animal had found amusing to drag around. The dog had carried this with the precision and care visible in the pressure marks on the leather, teeth marks that had not punctured or torn, that had gripped firmly but gently, the way one might carry an egg or a piece of fine china. This shoe meant something. To whom, John did not yet know. But the dog had chosen to bring it here, to this porch, to these feet, and that choice implied purpose. The animal had traveled some distance. That much was clear from its condition. It had suffered for this journey. And now it sat, bleeding and trembling and waiting, having delivered its burden with all the solemnity of a soldier reporting to a commanding officer with urgent intelligence. John set the shoe down carefully on the small wicker table beside his chair, positioning it with the same precision the dog had used when placing it before him. He looked at the animal, this uninvited messenger with its scarred face and intelligent eyes, and felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in so long that at first he did not recognize it for what it was. Connection, recognition, the acknowledgement of one wounded creature by another. The dog's tail moved slightly, just the tip, brushing against the porch floor in a gesture that might have been hope or relief or simply fatigue finally expressing itself. John reached out slowly, extending his weathered hand palm down in the universal gesture of peaceful intention. The dog did not flinch or retreat. It leaned forward, stretching its neck, and pressed its scarred muzzle against John's palm. The fur was coarser than Rusty's, matted with dirt and debris, but beneath that external roughness was warmth and the steady beating of a pulse against John's fingertips. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" John murmured, his thumb moving gently across the dog's brow, tracing the line of an old scar. "And you brought something important." The dog closed its eyes, leaning into the touch with a trust that felt unearned and precious and terrifying in its vulnerability. For the first time in 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days, John was touching another living thing with tenderness rather than routine, with intention rather than obligation. Rusty had moved to sit beside the stray, his presence calm and accepting. The three of them formed a tableau on the weathered porch as the last light of evening faded toward night. An old man, an aging dog, and a scarred stray, connected by a moment of understanding and a mysterious shoe that had traveled an unknown distance to arrive at these feet. In this place, at this exact moment when a lonely veteran had finally, perhaps unwillingly, perhaps unconsciously, opened his hand to receive what the universe had decided he needed. The brown leather shoe sat on the wicker table, casting a long shadow in the failing light, holding secrets John did not yet know but would soon discover. Secrets that would crack open the careful walls he had built around his heart and let something unexpected and necessary flow in. The possibility that healing could still arrive, even this late, even this broken, even after all hope had been carefully and deliberately put away. When John woke the next morning at his usual 5:45, his first conscious thought was of the dog. The realization unsettled him, that his mind had reached for something outside the narrow circuit of routine and solitude before he had even opened his eyes fully. He lay in bed for an extra minute, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember the last time another living being had occupied his thoughts upon waking. Ellen, perhaps, in those final months when every morning began with the question of whether she had made it through the night. Or Sarah, when she was small and prone to nightmares that required his presence in the doorway, backlit by the hallway light, reassuring her that the shadows held nothing dangerous. But that had been decades ago. Since then, his mornings had belonged only to the mechanics of his own aging body and the silent inventory of aches and limitations that marked another day survived. He dressed more quickly than usual, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind remained focused on the question that had followed him from sleep. Would the dog still be there? Part of him, the larger, more practiced part that had learned to expect disappointment as the natural state of things, assumed the animal would be gone. Stray dogs wandered. They moved through neighborhoods like ghosts, taking what they needed and moving on. The mysterious delivery of the shoe had been completed. The dog's strange mission, whatever it was, had concluded. By now the animal would be miles away, following some internal compass toward the next temporary shelter, the next scavenged meal, the next brief intersection with human life. But a smaller part of John, a part that felt both fragile and dangerous in its hopefulness, wondered if perhaps this time might be different. He opened the front door with more caution than necessary, as if making noise might shatter whatever delicate possibility the night had preserved. The early morning air rushed in, cool and sharp, carrying the scent of dew-wet grass and the distant promise of rain. The porch was exactly as he had left it. The rocking chair with its faded cushion, the wicker table, the hanging basket of dead geraniums. And curled in the corner where the porch wrapped around toward the eastern side of the house, pressed against the wall as if trying to make itself as small and unobtrusive as possible, was the dog. It lay with its head resting on its paws, eyes open, watching the door. When John appeared, the dog's tail gave a single tentative thump against the weathered floorboards, but it did not rise. It simply watched, waiting to see what John's presence might mean. Welcome or dismissal, kindness or threat. The brown shoe sat precisely where John had left it on the wicker table, as if the dog had been guarding it through the night. John stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand still on the doorframe, feeling the weight of a decision he had not yet consciously made but could already sense approaching. He could call animal control. The number was written on a faded list taped inside his kitchen drawer, along with the fire department and the utility companies and other services required for the maintenance of a solitary life. They would come with their humane traps and their practiced reassurances. They would take the dog to the shelter where it would wait in a cage for adoption or, more likely given its condition and obvious trauma, for the gentle needle that would end whatever suffering had brought it to this porch. That would be the reasonable thing, the practical thing, the thing that would restore his life to its careful order, free from the complication of another creature's needs and the unpredictable disruption of routine that came with any form of attachment. John looked at the dog. The dog looked back. And John walked past the telephone into the kitchen to make his tea. When he returned to the porch with his steaming mug, he brought a second bowl, an old ceramic dish that Ellen had used for mixing small batches of cookie dough, painted with faded blue flowers and chipped at one edge. He filled it with water from the kitchen tap and set it down at the corner of the porch, not close to the dog but close enough that the animal could reach it without approaching John directly. The dog watched this transaction with careful attention but did not move. John settled into his rocking chair, wrapping both hands around his tea, and together they watched the morning arrive. It took 15 minutes before the dog finally rose, stretched with the careful deliberation of a body that hurt in multiple places, and limped to the water bowl. It drank deeply, desperately, the sound of lapping tongue and grateful swallowing the only noise in the morning quiet. When the bowl was empty, the dog retreated to its corner and lay down again, eyes never leaving John's face. "You're welcome," John said quietly, surprising himself with the words. That evening, John brought scraps from his dinner. The gristle and fat trimmed from a pork chop, half a baked potato he couldn't finish. He placed them in a shallow pan on the porch steps, farther away than the water bowl, requiring the dog to expose itself, to leave the protective corner and cross open space to accept the offering. The dog waited until John had retreated to his chair before approaching the food. It ate with the controlled desperation of an animal that had learned not to waste opportunities. Each bite chewed thoroughly, nothing left behind but the memory of sustenance. On the third morning, John found himself adding an extra egg to his breakfast skillet, scrambling it without seasoning and bringing it out on a paper plate. The dog accepted this gift with the same cautious gratitude, never rushing, never demanding, always waiting for John to offer rather than assuming the right to take. By the fourth day, John had stopped pretending this was temporary. The blue-flowered bowl had become a permanent fixture on the porch, filled twice daily. The paper plates had been replaced with one of Rusty's old bowls, stainless steel and practical, placed in the same spot on the steps where the dog had learned to expect it. John found himself talking to the animal, not the one-sided commentary he offered Rusty, but actual conversation that seemed to require the presence of an audience that listened with full attention. "You need a name," John said on the fifth evening, watching the dog settle into its corner after finishing its dinner. "Can't keep calling you dog or you indefinitely. That's no way to address someone who's staying." The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound of John's voice. "Ellen would have had a name for you already," John continued, his voice softer now, accessing a part of himself that had been locked away with her clothes and her recipes and all the small domestic rituals that had died when she did. She was good at that. Seeing people, seeing animals, for what they really were and finding the right word to match. He looked at the scarred face, the wary eyes, the body that carried its trauma like a visible burden. "Buster," John said finally. "You look like a buster. Someone who's been through something and kept going anyway. Someone who doesn't quit even when quitting would be easier." The dog's tail moved once. A sweep across the porch floor that might have been acknowledgement or might have been coincidence. But John chose to believe it was the former. "Buster it is, then." The ritual established itself without conscious planning, the way all meaningful rituals do, through repetition and mutual understanding rather than explicit agreement. Each evening as the light began to fade, Buster would rise from his corner and walk to where the brown shoe sat on the wicker table. He would take it gently in his mouth, carry it to John's feet, and place it down with the same ceremonial precision he had used that first night. Then he would retreat 2 steps and sit, waiting. John would pick up the shoe, turn it in his hands, examine it as if expecting to find new information revealed, and then return it to the table. Buster would circle once, twice, and settle near the rocking chair, close enough now that John could reach down and touch the scarred head without fully extending his arm. This exchange happened every evening. John did not understand its purpose, but he honored it nonetheless, recognizing in the ritual something that mattered to Buster in a way that transcended explanation. The shoe had brought them together. The shoe's continued presence seemed to be the dog's way of reaffirming that connection, of ensuring that whatever bond had formed that first night remained intact. Mrs. Chun noticed Buster on her 6th morning walk past John's house. She slowed her power-walking pace, her expression shifting from neighborly politeness to genuine curiosity. "John, you got yourself a new dog?" she called from the sidewalk. "Seems he got himself me," John replied, surprising himself with the ease of the response. "Showed up a few days ago. Hasn't left yet." "He got a name?" "Buster." Mrs. Chun nodded, her eyes taking in the scarred face and the careful distance the dog maintained from John's chair. "He looks like he's had a hard time of it." "Haven't we all?" John said quietly. That afternoon, Mr. Henderson knocked on the door, the first time a neighbor had actually approached the house rather than waving from a safe distance in over a year. He carried a bag of dog food, the large economy size, still sealed. "Bought this for my daughter's retriever last month," Henderson explained, not quite meeting John's eyes. "Then she decided to move to Seattle and take the dog with her. Figured you might have use for it with your new friend there." John accepted the bag with a nod that carried more gratitude than words could have properly expressed. "That's kind of you, Henderson. We look out for each other," Henderson said simply. "That's what neighbors do." After Henderson left, John poured some of the kibble into Buster's bowl, supplementing the scraps and eggs that had been the dog's diet. Buster approached cautiously, sniffed the new food, and began to eat with what might have been relief, the recognition that perhaps this arrangement, whatever it was, might have some permanence to it. Rusty, who had watched these proceedings with patient dignity, walked over to Buster's bowl and touched noses with the younger dog in a gesture of unmistakable acceptance. The pack had expanded. The household had changed. And John, watching from his chair with his cold tea and his weathered hands and his heart that had learned to beat again in a rhythm that included others, felt something he had not felt in 7 years, 3 months, and 19 days. He felt less alone. The brown shoe sat on its table, catching the last rays of evening light, its leather cracked and weathered and holding secrets that John had not yet begun to unravel. But he would. In time, those secrets would reveal themselves. In time, John would understand why this particular dog had brought this particular shoe to this particular porch. But for now, in this moment, as Buster settled near his feet and Rusty dozed in the corner and the neighborhood prepared itself for another night, John allowed himself to simply sit with the quiet gratitude of a man who had been given an unexpected gift and had been wise enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to accept it. The walls around his heart had not crumbled. They had not even cracked in any visible way. But they had shifted, just slightly, allowing a small draft of air to flow through where before there had been only stillness. And that draft carried the scent of possibility, of change, of a future that might contain something more than the mere survival he had been practicing for so long. John reached down and rested his hand on Buster's head. The dog leaned into the touch, and the evening deepened into night around them, three souls sharing a porch and a silence that felt, for the first time in years, less like loneliness and more like peace. The morning walks had always been a solitary meditation, a 15-minute circuit of obligation rather than pleasure. John had walked because doctors said walking was good for aging joints, because staying still led to stiffness, because movement was maintenance and maintenance was survival. But he had walked alone, even with Rusty padding faithfully beside him, enclosed in the armor of his own thoughts and the careful avoidance of anything that might require him to stop, to engage, to connect. Buster changed that equation without asking permission. The first morning John clipped Rusty's leash and opened the front door to find Buster already standing at attention on the porch. It seemed natural, inevitable even, to bring both dogs. He had no second leash, so Buster would have to walk free. But the dog showed no inclination to stray. He positioned himself on John's left side while Rusty claimed the right, and together the three of them descended the porch steps into the cool morning air. They walked the same route John had walked for years, down Cedar Street to Maple, left on Maple to the small park with its collection of weathered playground equipment and empty benches, then back via Oak Street to complete the loop. But walking with Buster was different. The dog attracted attention in a way Rusty's familiar golden presence never had. People looked, people noticed, and noticing led to questions, and questions led to conversations John had spent years successfully avoiding. Mrs. Chun, completing her morning power walk, actually stopped when she saw them approaching. She pulled out her earbuds, a gesture that signaled an intention to do more than wave. "John, your new dog looks better already," she said, her eyes taking in Buster's still thin frame but noticing, as John had, that the worst of the matting had worked itself out, that the raw patches on his paws were beginning to heal, that some indefinable quality of defeated exhaustion had lifted from the animal's bearing. "He's eating regularly," John replied, feeling the unfamiliar rustle of conversation. The small talk he had forgotten how to navigate. "Makes a difference. What kind is he, you think? Mix of some kind." John looked down at Buster, who sat patiently during this exchange, his scarred face turned up toward the humans discussing him. "Shepherd, maybe. Collie. Bit of everything that knew how to survive, probably." Mrs. Chun laughed, a bright sound in the morning quiet. "Aren't we all a bit of everything that knew how to survive? That's what makes us interesting." She bent down, extending her hand for Buster to sniff. "You picked the right porch, buddy. This is a good man here, even if he pretends otherwise." John felt heat rise to his face, an emotion he couldn't quite name stirring in his chest. Before he could formulate a response, Mrs. Chun straightened and continued her walk, her hand rising in farewell as she replaced her earbuds. The walks became longer. John found reasons to extend the route, checking the community bulletin board at the park, walking past the small library to see what new books were displayed in the window, taking a detour down Birch Street where the old Victorian houses still maintained their original gardens. Buster seemed content to walk for as long as John was willing, his limp gradually diminishing with regular exercise and proper food, his coat beginning to show hints of what it must have been before hardship had dulled it, a rich mixture of browns and grays that caught the morning light. Other neighbors began to emerge from their houses at times that coincided with John's walks. Mr. Martinez with his terrier, The Hendersons, both of them now, strolling hand in hand before their workday began. The Patterson family with their 3 children, who begged to pet Buster and squealed with delight when the dog accepted their attention with patient tolerance. "What's his name?" the youngest Patterson child asked, a girl of perhaps 6 with missing front teeth and grass-stained knees. "Buster," John said. "That's a good name," she declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "He looks like a Buster. Does he know tricks?" "I haven't taught him any," John admitted. "You should teach him to shake hands. That's a good trick. My grandpa's dog knows how to shake hands." John found himself smiling, an expression his face had almost forgotten how to form. "I'll consider that." When the Patterson family moved on, their voices fading down the street, John looked at Buster. "Shake hands," he said quietly, "as if I'm the one who needs teaching tricks." But that evening, on the porch, John found himself extending his hand and saying, "Paw." Buster tilted his head, confused. John reached down and gently lifted one of the dog's front paws, placing it in his palm. "Paw," he repeated. They practiced this for 15 minutes, John offering his hand and guiding the gesture until Buster began to understand what was being asked. When the dog finally placed his paw in John's hand without prompting, John felt a ridiculous surge of pride and pleasure. "Good boy," he said, and Buster's tail swept the porch floor with unmistakable joy. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Buster's arrival. John was walking past the Henderson house when Margaret Henderson emerged from her front door, a coffee mug in each hand. "John, wait a moment," she called. John stopped, feeling the familiar urge to make excuses and continue walking, but Margaret was already approaching, her face open and friendly in a way that left no room for retreat without obvious rudeness. "I made too much coffee," she said, which they both knew was a polite fiction. "Thought you might want a cup. We could sit on your porch for a bit. I haven't had a chance to really meet your new dog properly." John accepted the mug because refusing seemed more complicated than accepting. They walked back to his porch, a journey of perhaps 50 yards that felt like crossing some invisible border into territory John had carefully marked as off-limits to outside intrusion. Margaret settled into the second chair, the one Ellen had always used, the one that had sat empty for 7 years, 3 months, and 26 days. John's instinct was to protest, to find some reason why that particular chair shouldn't be occupied. But Margaret was already sitting, already sipping her coffee, already engaging Buster in quiet conversation as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "He's a handsome dog under all that hard living," Margaret observed. "You can see the quality in his eyes, intelligence there, and loyalty, I'd bet. Once he decides you're his person, that's it, you're his forever." "He decided that pretty quickly," John admitted. "Showed up one evening and hasn't left since. That's how it works sometimes. The universe sends us what we need, not always what we think we want." Margaret's gaze drifted to the wicker table where the brown shoe sat in its place of honor. "That's an interesting thing to keep on your porch." John followed her gaze. The shoe sat in morning light, its cracked leather showing every mark of age and use. "Buster brought it. First night he arrived. Carried it up the steps and placed it at my feet like he was delivering a message." "And was he delivering a message?" "I don't know yet," John said honestly. "But it meant something to him. Still does. Every evening he takes it from the table and brings it to me, like he's reminding me it's important." Margaret studied the shoe with the careful attention of someone who understood that objects could carry weight beyond their physical mass. "It's old. Military, maybe? The way it's constructed." "That's what I thought too. You were military, weren't you? Tom mentioned it once. Said you'd been in Vietnam." The name hit John like a physical blow. Tom. His neighbor Tom Henderson had mentioned John's service, which meant Tom Henderson knew, which meant Tom Henderson had been interested enough in John's history to remember it and share it with his wife. "I was," John said carefully. "Long time ago. Tom respects that. He wanted to serve but couldn't, heart murmur they found during his physical. Always felt like he missed something important." Margaret sipped her coffee, her eyes kind. "He'd like to talk to you about it sometime if you're ever willing." He doesn't push, but I know he's curious. What it was like. What you learned. John sat with this information, feeling the old walls trying to reassert themselves, trying to close off this avenue of conversation before it could lead anywhere vulnerable. But Buster had moved to sit between them, his scarred head resting against John's knee, and somehow the dog's presence made it harder to retreat into familiar defenses. It was a long time ago, John repeated, but this time the words felt less like a wall and more like a door being held slightly ajar. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, and when Margaret rose to leave, she touched John's shoulder briefly. "Thank you for the company. Let's do this again." After she left, John sat looking at the brown shoe, feeling the weight of a name that had been spoken in his presence, Tom, and feeling too the unexpected warmth of human connection that had somehow breached his carefully maintained isolation. The walks continued to expand. John found himself accepting greetings rather than simply acknowledging them. He learned the names of the Patterson children, Emma, James, and little Sophie. He discovered that Mr. Martinez was a retired teacher who had spent 30 years trying to convince teenagers that poetry mattered. He learned that Mrs. Chun was a widow like himself, her husband lost to a sudden heart attack 5 years ago, while trimming the hedge that she now maintained with meticulous care because it was something he had loved. One morning, John heard himself laughing at something Mr. Martinez said about his terrier's stubborn refusal to learn any command that wasn't directly related to getting food. The sound of his own laughter surprised him. Rusty and unpracticed, but genuine. He had forgotten what his own joy sounded like. The neighborhood began to see a different John. The man who had been a ghost, a weathered figure on a porch who acknowledged existence but didn't participate in it, was slowly becoming present. He made eye contact now. He remembered details of previous conversations and asked follow-up questions. He stood straighter, walked with slightly less reluctance, even smiled occasionally when the Patterson children performed elaborate tricks with their jump ropes. On the porch each evening, the ritual continued. Buster brought the shoe. John examined it. The shoe returned to its table. And gradually, John began to understand that the shoe wasn't just a mystery to be solved. It was a bridge. It had brought Buster to his porch. Buster had brought John back into the world. And the world, cautiously, gently, was welcoming him back. But the shoe still held its secrets. And John, watching Buster's careful evening presentation of the worn leather, understood that those secrets were waiting for their moment, for the right time to reveal themselves and complete whatever healing they had been sent to accomplish. For now, though, John sat with his dogs, greeted his neighbors, drank coffee with Margaret Henderson, and allowed himself to believe that perhaps it wasn't too late, that perhaps even at 78 with a body held together by pins and stubbornness and a heart that had forgotten how to hope, change was still possible. Healing was still possible. Connection was still possible. The brown shoe caught the evening light, and John reached down to rest his hand on Buster's scarred head, and together they waited for whatever came next. It began with the weather, as so many things do when conversation requires an opening that feels safe and neutral. John was sitting on Margaret Henderson's back porch 3 weeks after Buster's arrival, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, watching clouds build on the western horizon. The air had that particular thickness that precedes a storm, humid and still, the kind of air that made breathing feel like work. "Going to rain hard," Margaret observed, following his gaze. "Reminds me of the monsoons," John said, the words emerging before his internal censor could intervene. "In Vietnam, the way the air would get heavy like this, and you'd know what was coming but you couldn't do anything except wait for it." Margaret turned to look at him, her expression careful, giving him space to continue or retreat as he chose. John took a sip of his tea, feeling the cool liquid against the sudden dryness in his throat. He had not spoken about Vietnam in any specific way since Ellen died. Even with her, the stories had been rationed, doled out in small doses over decades, always edited, always stripped of the worst details that would have given her nightmares on his behalf. "The rain there wasn't like rain here," John continued, surprised to find himself still talking. "It was angry, like the sky was trying to drown us. Everything would turn to mud in minutes, your boots, your rifle, your soul. You'd be soaked through and you'd stay that way for days, weeks sometimes. Your skin would start to rot. Your feet would turn white and soft and pieces would just come off. That sounds unbearable, Margaret said softly. We bore it anyway. Didn't have much choice. John's fingers tightened on the sweating glass. Had a buddy named Tom. He was from somewhere in the Midwest, Ohio, maybe, or Indiana. He had this thing he used to say whenever it started raining, well, at least the mosquitoes will drown. Like it was a trade-off we could live with, rot in exchange for fewer mosquitoes. Margaret smiled gently. Did the mosquitoes drown? No. They thrived. Everything that wanted to kill us thrived. John paused, feeling the weight of memory settling on his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome coat. Tom could fix anything, though. Give him duct tape and some wire and he'd keep equipment running that should have been dead a week ago. Radios, weapons, boots held together with nothing but faith and adhesive. He saved my life twice with those hands of his. What happened to him? The question hung in the humid air. John looked at his own weathered hands, seeing the liver spots and the scars and the tremor that had started appearing in recent years. He looked at hands that had survived when Tom's had not. Lost him in '68, John said quietly. Ambush outside a village whose name I can't even remember anymore. He was there 1 minute, fixing a jammed radio so we could call for support, and then he was gone. Just like that. The jungle took him, and we left him there because we had to move or we'd all be taken too. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Margaret didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She simply sat, bearing witness to pain that had been carried in silence for too long. The storm broke over them then, rain hammering the porch roof with the same fury John had described, and they sat watching water cascade off the gutters while the thunder rolled across the sky like artillery fire that never quite faded. The dam, once cracked, could not be easily repaired. In the days that followed, John found the stories coming more frequently, triggered by unexpected stimuli that his mind had learned to associate with memory. A plane flying overhead brought back tales of helicopter evacuations, the desperate scramble to reach the landing zone before the enemy closed in. The smell of diesel from a passing truck returned him to the motor pool where he and Tom had spent countless hours maintaining vehicles that were perpetually one breakdown away from catastrophe. Tom Henderson, John discovered, was genuinely interested in these stories. The man would sit on John's porch in the evenings, buster between them like a bridge, and ask careful questions that showed respect for the weight of what was being shared. "What did you do before the war?" Tom asked one evening. "I was training to be a teacher," John said, the admission surprising him. He had not thought about that version of himself in decades. "History. Thought I'd teach high school, help kids understand how we got to where we are. Then the draft came and history stopped being something I studied and started being something I survived." "Did you ever go back to teaching?" "No. Came home and everything felt wrong. The classrooms, the textbooks, the neat little narratives about causes and consequences. I couldn't stand in front of kids and pretend that history was clean and logical when I knew what it actually was. Chaos and blood and boys dying in mud while their mothers thought they were heroes." John's voice had gone rough. "So I learned carpentry instead. Built things. Fixed things. Kept my hands busy so my head couldn't work too hard." Mr. Martinez, the retired teacher, overheard this conversation during one of his morning walks. He stopped, his terrier sitting patiently at his feet, and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing words for maximum impact. "I taught history for 30 years, Martinez said, "and the best lesson I ever learned was that history isn't clean or logical. It's exactly what you said. Chaos and blood and regular people trying to survive extraordinary circumstances. The ones who pretend otherwise are the ones who never learned the real lesson." John looked at the older man. Martinez had to be at least 80, his face a roadmap of time survived, and nodded slowly. "My brother was in Korea," Martinez continued. "He came back different. Couldn't talk about it for 40 years. Then one day he started, and once he started, he couldn't stop. The stories poured out of him like water from a broken dam. He said it was the best thing he ever did, even though it hurt like hell. Said carrying it alone was killing him slower than any bullet could have." The comparison resonated in John's chest, A tuning fork struck to the right frequency. Carrying it alone was killing him slower than any bullet. Yes, that was exactly right. Mrs. Chun heard him talking one morning about the heat, how it compared to the oppressive humidity of Southeast Asia, and she shared that her husband had been a Vietnamese refugee, one of the boat people who had risked everything to escape after the fall of Saigon. He had carried his own stories, she said, his own weight of memory that he could never fully articulate but that had shaped every day of his life in America. He used to say that war doesn't end when the shooting stops, Mrs. Chun said quietly. It just moves inside and continues there, where no one else can see it. John felt seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and oddly liberating. These people, his neighbors, who he had kept at careful distance for years, were not strangers to suffering. They carried their own losses, their own battles, their own scars. And by sharing his, he was not burdening them but joining them in the honest acknowledgement of what it meant to be human and to survive what survival required. The stories came more easily in Buster's presence. The dog had a way of settling at John's feet during these conversations, his scarred head resting on John's boot, his dark eyes half closed in what might have been sleep or might have been the focused listening of a creature who understood that bearing witness was itself a form of healing. John told them about the fear, not the Hollywood version of fear that came in dramatic bursts during combat, but the grinding, exhausting fear that was simply the baseline state of existence. The fear of stepping on a mine, of trusting the wrong person, of falling asleep and never waking up, of surviving when better men did not. He told them about the friendships forged in that fear, bonds that felt deeper than blood because they were written in shared trauma and the absolute knowledge that these were the people who would die for you and you for them, not out of nobility but out of the simple mathematics of survival. He told them about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear these stories, that wanted its veterans to be either heroes who could be paraded or victims who could be pitted, with no room for the complicated truth of men who had done what war required and were trying to figure out how to live with that afterward. Tom used to say we'd get through it, John said one evening, Buster's steady breathing creating a rhythm that made speaking easier. He'd say, "We'll get through this, Johnny, and then we'll go home and build something good. We'll make this mean something." He believed that, even when everything was falling apart around us, even when we were covered in mud and blood and worse, he believed we'd get through and find a way to make it mean something. But he didn't get through, Margaret said gently. No, he didn't, and I did. And I've spent 50 years trying to figure out what the hell to do with that. John's voice cracked. I couldn't make it mean anything, Margaret. I tried. I married Ellen. I raised Sarah. I built houses and fixed things and pretended I was fine. But I couldn't make Tom's death mean anything except that he died and I didn't. And that's just random chance masquerading as fate. Margaret reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over John's weathered knuckles. Maybe making it mean something isn't about building monuments or becoming a hero. Maybe it's about this, sitting on a porch with a scarred dog and your neighbors, telling the truth about what happened and letting people care that it happened to you. Maybe Tom didn't die so you could do something extraordinary. Maybe he died so you could survive, and surviving is enough. John looked at Buster, who had raised his head at the emotion in John's voice. The dog's dark eyes held that quality of knowing recognition, that sense of another scarred survivor who understood that sometimes just continuing to breathe was the extraordinary thing. I think Tom would have liked you, John said to the dog. He had a way with broken things. He'd have seen what you are under all that damage. Same way he always saw what I could be under all my fear. The evening ritual took on new meaning after that. When Buster brought the brown shoe to John's feet each night, John found himself talking to the shoe, to Buster, to the memory of all the Toms he had known and lost. I don't know whose shoe this was, John would say, turning the worn leather in his hands. But they walked far in it. They wore it until it had nothing left to give, and they wore it some more. That's what we did too, Tom and I. We kept going until we had nothing left, and then we kept going because stopping wasn't an option. The weight of the memories didn't disappear, but shared, spoken aloud, witnessed by patient neighbors and a scarred dog who brought a mysterious shoe each evening as if to say, yes, this matters, your story matters, you matter. The weight became something John could carry without being crushed beneath it. And late at night, When the neighborhood slept and Buster dozed on the porch and the brown shoe sat in its place of honor on the wicker table, John would sometimes whisper to the darkness, "I survived, Tom. I don't know why, and I don't know if I made it mean anything, but I survived. And today I told someone your name and they listened, and for a minute you were alive again in the telling. That's something. Maybe it's not enough, but it's something." The shoe offered no response except its continued presence, solid and real and waiting for whatever revelation it had been sent to deliver when the time was right and John was finally ready to receive it. The decision to move the shoe happened without conscious deliberation, the way important decisions sometimes do when they've been percolating beneath the surface of awareness for long enough that action becomes inevitable rather than chosen. John woke one morning 6 weeks after Buster's arrival and knew, with the clarity that occasionally visits in those first moments between sleep and full consciousness, that the brown shoe no longer belonged on the porch. It belonged inside. It belonged with the other artifacts of memory that he had carefully curated on the shelf in his living room. The photographs, the medals he never wore, the folded flag that had been presented to him at a funeral he could barely remember attending because grief had made everything soft and distant. After breakfast, after the morning walk with both dogs, after Rusty had settled in his usual spot near the fireplace and Buster had claimed the corner by the window where sunlight pooled in the late morning, John went to the porch and picked up the brown shoe. It felt heavier than it had that first night, weighted not with physical mass but with accumulated meaning. This was no longer simply a worn piece of leather. It had become a talisman, a bridge between past and present, a physical manifestation of connection that transcended explanation. John carried it inside and stood before the shelf that held his history. The wedding photograph, Ellen in her simple white dress, her smile radiant with the confidence of someone who believed the future would be kind. The picture of Sarah at 5 years old, gap-toothed and holding a dandelion like it was the most precious flower in creation. His bronze star, tarnished now, pinned to faded ribbon in a frame that had been Ellen's idea because she believed his service should be honored even if he couldn't bear to look at it most days. The flag from Ellen's funeral, folded with military precision, triangular and severe and representing a country that had taken from him more than it had given but which he had served anyway because service was what one did. He moved the flag slightly to the left, creating space. He placed the brown shoe in that space, positioning it with care so that it sat upright, the worn sole flat against the wood, the laces hanging to one side. It looked right there, nestled among the other relics of a long life marked by love and loss and survival. It looked like it belonged. Buster had followed John into the living room, an unusual occurrence since the dog typically maintained his station on the porch or in his corner unless called. He sat now at John's feet, looking up at the shelf, his tail giving a slow sweep across the hardwood floor. If dogs could express approval, John thought this would be it. "It's part of the family now," John said quietly, his hand resting on Buster's scarred head. "Whatever it means, whoever it belonged to, it's part of our story now." The days that followed carried a different quality, though John would have been hard-pressed to articulate exactly what had changed. The shoe's presence in the living room felt like a declaration, a statement of acceptance that what had seemed strange and inexplicable had become integrated into the fabric of his daily existence. He found himself pausing throughout the day to look at it, this artifact sitting among his other carefully preserved memories, and each time he looked, he felt something shift a little further toward what might have been peace. He began to understand what the shoe represented, or at least what it had come to represent in the weeks since its arrival. It was not just one soldier's boot. It was every soldier's boot, the ones who had walked through jungles and deserts and frozen mountains, who had marched until their feet bled and then marched some more because stopping meant dying. It was Tom's boot, even though it couldn't literally be Tom's, because Tom had been buried in whatever boots he'd died in, if he'd even gotten a burial rather than being left in jungle mud while his unit retreated under fire. The shoe was sacrifice made visible. It was the miles walked that no one celebrated, the exhaustion borne that no one acknowledged, the determination to keep moving that was the real heroism of war. Not the dramatic gestures but the grinding persistence of simply continuing to put one foot in front of the other when everything in you was screaming to stop. And it was healing, too. It had brought Buster, and Buster had brought connection, and connection had brought John back into a life he had been slowly abandoning without even realizing it. The shoe was the catalyst, the unlikely instrument of salvation delivered on 4 paws by a scarred dog who understood, in whatever way dogs understand such things, that this man and this object needed to find each other. John found himself talking to the shoe more frequently, the way he had once talked to Ellen's photograph after she died. Not expecting answers but needing to speak aloud the thoughts that rattled too loudly in the confines of his skull. "I was dying," he told the shoe one afternoon while Rusty dozed and Buster kept his patient vigil by the window. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice from the outside. But I was dying the way plants die when you stop watering them. A little bit each day, browning at the edges, curling inward, withering. I was watering myself just enough to keep breathing, but not enough to actually live. The shoe sat silent on its shelf, keeping company with the other witnesses to his history. Ellen knew. Before she died, she knew I was already starting to disappear. She asked me to promise I'd stay connected, that I wouldn't let the silence eat me. And I promised because you promise things to dying people even when you know you can't keep them. John's voice roughened. I broke that promise. I let the silence eat me. I let 7 years go by pretending that existing was the same as living. Buster moved from his window post to sit beside John's chair, leaning his weight against John's leg in silent solidarity. But then you arrived, John continued, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. You brought this shoe like it was a message I was supposed to understand. And maybe I'm crazy, but I think I'm starting to understand it. The message isn't about whose shoe it was. It's about what the shoe represents. That someone walked their miles, that their journey mattered, that the steps they took left an imprint even if the world forgot their name. He looked at the shelf, at the constellation of objects that mapped a life. Love, service, loss, memory, and now this unexpected addition that had catalyzed everything that followed. Tom walked his miles, John said softly. He wore his boots down to nothing, trying to keep us alive, trying to fix what was broken, trying to believe that we'd get through it and make something good on the other side. He didn't get to make that good thing himself, but maybe the point is that I'm supposed to make it. Not some grand gesture or monument. Just this, living, being present, telling the stories so they don't die with me. Sitting on a porch with a scarred dog and neighbors who care enough to listen. Maybe that's the good thing Tom didn't live to build. Maybe I'm building it now, 50 years late, but building it nonetheless. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the living room floor. John sat with his hand on Buster's head, looking at his shelf of memories, and felt something that had been clenched tight in his chest for longer than he could remember finally begin to loosen. He had been carrying survivor's guilt like a stone in his pocket for half a century, feeling its weight with every step, letting it drag him down by increments until he had convinced himself that the weight was simply part of who he was. But the shoe, this mysterious, weathered artifact, had somehow become a counterweight, a reminder that survival itself could be a form of honoring the dead if survival meant continuing to walk, to connect, to bear witness to the value of the miles traveled. That evening, when Buster rose from his corner and walked to where the shoe now sat on its shelf, John understood that the ritual was changing. The dog stood before the shelf for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the brown leather, and then he turned and walked back to John. He sat at John's feet, placed his scarred muzzle on John's knee, and simply waited. "You're telling me it's time," John murmured, his hand finding the familiar territory of the dog's head. "Time to stop treating it like a mystery that needs solving and start treating it like a memorial that needs honoring." Buster's tail moved once, an affirmation or perhaps just a coincidence. But John chose to believe it was the former. "All right then, the shoe stays on the shelf. With Ellen and Sarah and the medals and the flag. With everything that matters. And every day I'll look at it and remember. Remember Tom. Remember what we survived. Remember that I'm still here and that being here is enough. That's what you've been trying to teach me, isn't it? That I don't have to do something extraordinary to justify surviving. I just have to survive well. Live in a way that honors the fact that I got years Tom didn't get." The room settled into comfortable silence, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty, occupied by presence rather than absence. Outside, the neighborhood continued its evening routines. Children called in for dinner, cars returning from workdays, the familiar symphony of ordinary life. And inside, an old veteran sat with his dogs and his memories and a brown shoe that had traveled an unknown distance to arrive exactly where it needed to be, carrying with it the message that healing often comes from the most unexpected sources and takes forms we could never anticipate but must be wise enough to accept when they appear. John reached up and touched the shoe lightly, his fingers tracing the cracked leather, the worn laces, the sole that had walked so many miles. "Thank you," he whispered, not entirely sure if he was thanking the shoe, or Buster or Tom, or the universe that had conspired to bring them all together in this moment. "Thank you for reminding me what it means to be alive." The shoe sat among its companions on the shelf, a symbol of sacrifice and survival and the long, hard miles that every life travels. And John sat with his dogs, feeling less alone than he had in 7 years, 3 months, and 43 days, knowing that he had finally begun to understand what Buster had been trying to tell him from that very first evening when a scarred dog had climbed the porch steps carrying a message written in worn leather and weathered laces. That the way forward begins with honoring the past, and that healing requires the courage to let unexpected grace find its way in. The first snow arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, for months after Buster had walked into John's life carrying his mysterious burden. John woke to a world transformed. The familiar landscape of his neighborhood softened and muted beneath a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new and full of possibility. He stood at his bedroom window in his thermal underwear and Ellen's cardigan, watching the flakes drift down with the lazy, unhurried pace of snow that knows it has all day to accumulate. Buster was already awake, sitting at the back door with his nose pressed against the glass, his tail sweeping slow arcs across the kitchen floor. When John appeared, the dog turned with an expression that seemed to ask permission, though for what John wasn't entirely sure until he opened the door and Buster bounded into the pristine yard like a puppy rather than a middle-aged dog who had known too much hardship. The transformation was remarkable. This was not the cautious, wounded creature who had limped onto John's porch 4 months ago. This was a dog who had rediscovered joy, who played in the snow with abandon, leaping and diving and emerging with his muzzle dusted white, his eyes bright with delight. Rusty followed at a more sedate pace, his golden coat stark against the whiteness, but even he seemed invigorated by the change in weather, pausing to catch snowflakes on his tongue with dignified enthusiasm. John stood on the porch wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, and felt something expand in his chest. For months ago he would have looked at this snow and seen only inconvenience, sidewalks to clear, ice to navigate with his bad hip, cold that would make his joints ache worse than usual. But now, watching his dogs play in the early morning light, he saw beauty. He saw possibility. He saw life happening instead of just passing by. The months since Buster's arrival had accumulated like snow, each day adding a layer to the transformation John hadn't fully recognized until he stood back and saw the whole landscape changed. Buster no longer slept on the porch, curled defensively in a corner. He had claimed a spot on the rug near John's bed, close enough that John could hear his breathing in the night, a steady rhythm that had replaced the oppressive silence that had once made darkness unbearable. On particularly cold nights, the dog would rest his chin on the edge of John's mattress, seeking closeness, and John would reach down to touch the scarred head, and they would both sleep better for the contact. The morning walks had expanded into the center of John's daily routine rather than a chore to be endured. He and both dogs would set out at 7, sometimes earlier if the weather was particularly fine, and cover twice the distance they had when it was just him and Rusty going through the motions of survival. They had discovered new routes, the path along the creek that was beautiful when the leaves turned red and gold, the trail through the small woods at the edge of town where Buster could run off-leash and still return when called, the route past the community center where John had, surprisingly, started volunteering 2 mornings a week. That volunteer work had begun with Margaret Henderson's gentle insistence. The community center needed someone to help organize donated books in the lending library, a task that required no particular skill beyond alphabetization and patience. John had agreed mostly because saying no to Margaret had become increasingly difficult, but he had discovered something unexpected in the work. He liked it. He liked the quiet focus of arranging books by author and genre. He liked the occasional conversations with people who came to browse the shelves. He liked having somewhere to be, something to do that mattered to someone other than himself. The Veterans Support Group had been Tom Henderson's suggestion, offered with careful casualness over coffee one morning. "There's a group that meets Thursday evenings at the VFW Hall," Tom had said. "My uncle used to go before he passed. Said it helped, having people who understood without needing everything explained." John had resisted at first, the old reflexes of isolation asserting themselves. But Tom had persisted with gentle patience, and eventually John had agreed to attend one meeting, just to see. That first meeting had been awkward. A room full of men and a few women, various ages, various wars, all carrying variations of the same weight. But the second meeting had been easier. And by the fourth meeting, John was contributing to conversations, sharing pieces of his own experience, listening to others share theirs, and feeling the particular relief that comes from being understood by people who have walked similar miles. His neighbors commented on the change, though they were too polite to be direct about it. Mrs. Chun mentioned that he seemed to be smiling more. Mr. Martinez noted that his posture had improved, that he stood straighter, walked with more confidence. The Patterson children simply declared that he looked less like a grumpy grandpa and more like a regular grandpa, which John chose to take as a compliment. Even Sarah had noticed during their monthly phone call, which had gradually expanded from 15 minutes of stilted politeness to nearly an hour of actual conversation. "You sound different, Dad," she had said, her voice carrying a tentative hope that made John's chest tight. "You sound like, I don't know, like you're there again, present." "I got a dog," John had told her. "Well, a dog got me. It's complicated." "I'm glad," Sarah had said simply. "Mom would be glad too." The snow continued to fall through the morning, accumulating in drifts against the porch railing, coating the branches of the oak tree, transforming the brown shoes worn leather on its shelf into a dark contrast against the white world visible through the window. John made tea and settled into his chair with a blanket across his knees, Buster curled at his feet, Rusty dozing near the fireplace where embers from the morning's fire still glowed with fading warmth. This was contentment, John realized. Not happiness exactly, that seemed too bright and temporary a word for what he felt. But contentment, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, which was simply sitting with his dogs and watching snow fall while the world went about its business. The mail truck arrived at its usual time, its chains crunching through the snow, brake lights flaring red against the white landscape as it stopped at each mailbox. John saw the carrier, a young woman named Jessica who had taken over the route 2 years ago, deposit something in his box before moving on. He would retrieve it later after his tea, after the snow stopped, after there was a reason to venture off the porch into the cold. But some instinct made him rise sooner than he might have otherwise. Perhaps it was the way Buster lifted his head when the mail truck passed, his ears pricking forward with sudden attention. Perhaps it was simply the restlessness that sometimes comes with changing weather. Whatever the reason, John pulled on his boots and his heavy coat and made his way down the porch steps, using his cane for balance on the snow-slick wood. The mailbox held the usual assortment, a utility bill, 2 pieces of junk mail advertising services he would never need, and a cream-colored envelope addressed in careful, feminine handwriting. No return address, but a postmark from a town about 40 miles away, a place called Millbrook that John had perhaps driven through once or twice in his life but had no particular connection to. He carried the mail back inside, setting aside the bill and discarding the junk mail, his attention caught by the cream envelope. It was quality stationery, the kind people used for important correspondence, wedding invitations or sympathy cards or letters that required a certain formality. His name and address were written with old-fashioned precision, each letter formed with care, suggesting someone who had been taught penmanship as an art rather than a mere functional skill. John sat in his chair and opened the envelope carefully, using his pocket knife to slice the flap rather than tearing it. Inside was a single sheet of matching cream stationery, covered in the same careful handwriting, and a small photograph that fell into his lap, a black and white image of a young soldier in dress uniform, his smile wide and confident, his eyes bright with the certainty of youth that believes the future will be kind. John picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. He knew that face. He knew it the way you know your own reflection, The way you know a melody that defined your youth. The way you know the landscape of dreams that have repeated themselves for 50 years. Tom. Thomas Brennan. The boy from Ohio who could fix anything, who believed they would survive and build something good, who had died in jungle mud in 1968 while trying to get a jammed radio working so they could call for support that arrived too late. John's hands shook as he unfolded the letter. His vision blurring as tears he hadn't felt forming began to track down his weathered cheeks. The words swam before his eyes, and he had to blink several times before they came into focus. Dear Mr. Ward, my name is Clara Brennan. I hope this letter finds you well, and I hope you'll forgive me for writing to you unexpectedly after so many years. I'm not entirely sure how to begin, so I'll start with what I observed and work backward to the explanation. Asterisk. 3 weeks ago, I was driving through your neighborhood on my way to visit my sister who lives on Oak Street. I happened to glance at your house as I passed. It's a lovely home, by the way, with a beautiful porch, and through your front window I saw something that made me pull over immediately. Sitting on a shelf in your living room, visible from the street, was a brown leather shoe that I recognized despite the distance and the years. Asterisk. It was my husband's shoe. Tom's shoe. I know this with absolute certainty because I bought him those boots for Christmas in 1967, just before he shipped out to Vietnam. They were expensive, more than we could really afford on his private's pay and my secretary's salary, but he needed good boots and I wanted him to have the best I could give him. I watched him lace them up that last morning before he left, watched him tie them with that particular knot he'd learned in basic training, the one that wouldn't come undone no matter what he walked through. Asterisk. Tom died in March of 1968. You knew him, Mr. Ward. I found your name in his letters home, mentioned several times. Johnny's the best scout we have, he wrote. Johnny can read terrain like it's a book written just for him. And later, Johnny and I are going to make it through this. We have plans. Asterisk. John's breath caught in his throat. He set the letter down, his hands shaking too badly to hold it steady, and looked at Buster. The dog had risen from his spot at John's feet and now sat directly in front of him. His dark eyes fixed on John's face with an intensity that felt almost human in its understanding. You knew, John whispered. Somehow you knew. He picked up the letter again, forcing himself to continue reading through tears that would not stop falling. Asterisk. When Tom died, the army sent me his personal effects, including the boots he'd been wearing. One of them was missing, lost in the chaos of the evacuation, they said, or perhaps left behind in the jungle. I kept the remaining boot for 3 years, moving it from apartment to apartment, unable to throw it away but unable to look at it either. Finally, in 1971, when I moved to Millbrook to start over, I left it behind in the garage of my old rental house. I couldn't carry it anymore, Mr. Ward. The weight of it was killing me. Asterisk. I don't know how that boot traveled from a forgotten garage to your shelf. I don't know the path it took or the hands it passed through or the years it waited to find its way to you. But when I saw it sitting among your photographs and medals, I knew immediately that this was where it was supposed to be. Not with me, frozen in grief I couldn't process, but with you, someone who knew Tom, who survived when he didn't, who could honor his memory in a way I never managed to do. Asterisk. I looked up your address and learned that you have a dog. A rescue, people said. A stray who appeared one day and never left. Mr. Ward, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe that sometimes the universe finds ways to heal wounds we didn't even know we could heal. That boot traveled an impossible distance to find you, carried by a dog who chose you, and it arrived exactly when you needed it to arrive. Asterisk. I wanted you to know that I'm grateful. Grateful that Tom's memory is being honored by someone who understood what he gave, who walked the same miles, who knows what those boots represented. You don't owe me any response to this letter. I simply wanted you to know that I saw, and I understood, and I'm grateful that fate or grace or whatever name you give to the inexplicable brought Tom back to someone who could truly remember him. Asterisk. With deepest respect, Clara Brennan. John sat in his chair as the snow continued to fall outside, the letter trembling in his hands, the photograph of young Tom Brennan lying in his lap, and Buster pressed against his legs as if the dog could somehow anchor him to the present while the past rushed in with overwhelming force. The brown shoe on the shelf. Tom's shoe, impossibly, inexplicably Tom's actual shoe, sat in its place of honor, and John understood finally what Buster had been trying to tell him from that very first evening. This wasn't a mystery. It was a message. It was closure. It was the universe or fate or grace saying, Asterisk, you don't have to carry this alone anymore. He's been honored. He's been remembered. You can let go of the guilt and hold onto the love instead. Asterisk. John wept then, truly wept, for the first time since Tom had died 56 years ago. He wept for the boy from Ohio who could fix anything except the bullet that found him. He wept for the decades of guilt he had carried, the weight of surviving when better men had not. He wept for Clara, who had loved Tom and lost him and found the strength to let his memory find its proper home. And he wept for himself, for the lonely veteran who had been dying slowly until a scarred dog had carried an impossible gift and taught him how to live again. Buster stayed pressed against him through it all, patient and steady, fulfilling the mission he had somehow been assigned by forces beyond understanding. And when John's tears finally slowed and he could breathe again without his chest hitching, he reached down and pulled the dog's scarred face up to meet his own. "Thank you," John whispered. "Thank you for bringing him back to me. Thank you for not letting me die alone with it. Thank you for knowing what I needed before I knew myself." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, making everything new. And inside, an old veteran held a letter from a widow who understood, and a photograph of a friend lost long ago, and he felt the weight of 56 years finally begin to lift. John sat at his kitchen table that evening, a blank sheet of cream-colored stationery before him that Margaret Henderson had given him when he'd mentioned needing to write an important letter. The good pen Ellen had bought him for their 20th anniversary, the one he'd kept in a drawer untouched for years, because using it felt like using up the last physical connection to her thoughtfulness, now rested in his hand. Buster lay at his feet, Rusty dozed by the back door, and the house held the particular quiet that makes writing possible. He had read Clara's letter 7 times throughout the day, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, new connections he hadn't immediately grasped. The photograph of young Tom sat propped against the sugar bowl, those bright eyes watching John attempt to find words adequate to the moment. It shouldn't have been difficult. He had so much to say, so much that had been locked inside for decades that now wanted to pour out onto the page. But that was precisely the problem. Too much. How did you compress 56 years of grief and guilt and gratitude into a letter that wouldn't overwhelm a widow who had carried her own weight of loss for just as long? He started 4 times, crumpling each attempt and adding it to the small pile of failures beside his elbow. The first was too formal, reading like an official document rather than a conversation between 2 people bound by shared loss. The second was too casual, striking a tone that felt disrespectful to the gravity of what Clara had revealed. The third dissolved into rambling, his thoughts scattering in too many directions at once. The fourth simply said, "Thank you," over and over until the words lost meaning through repetition. On the 5th attempt, John stopped trying to be adequate and simply began to write the truth. "Dear Clara, I received your letter this morning. I've read it 7 times and I'm still not sure I fully comprehend what you've told me, but I'm going to try to respond as honestly as I know how. Tom Brennan saved my life twice in Vietnam. Once literally. He pulled me behind cover when I froze during an ambush, my body refusing to move even as bullets tore up the ground where I'd been standing. The second time was slower, quieter. I was 19 years old and terrified every single second of every single day, convinced I would die in that jungle and nobody back home would understand or care. Tom saw that fear and he didn't mock it or dismiss it. He just sat with me during those long nights and told me stories about Ohio, about his plans for after the war, about the girl he was going to marry who wrote him letters that smelled like lavender. That girl was you, Clara. He carried your letters in a plastic bag he kept sealed tight to protect them from the rain. He'd read them aloud sometimes, when the night was particularly long and scary, and the sound of your words in his voice made the jungle feel less like the end of the world and more like something we might actually survive. Asterisk, when Tom died, I wrote you a letter. I never sent it. I started it a dozen times and could never find the right words to explain that he'd been trying to fix a radio, that he'd been doing what he always did, keeping us connected, keeping us functional, refusing to accept that anything was too broken to repair. I couldn't find words that would make his death make sense, so I never sent anything. I've regretted that silence for 56 years. Asterisk. Asterisk, I want to tell you what the shoe has meant to me, but I'm not sure I can explain it in a way that sounds rational. For months ago, I was dying. Not dramatically. I was still breathing, still eating, still going through the motions of existence. But I had let go of any real engagement with life. I was a ghost in my own house, waiting without purpose or hope for the final darkness to arrive and release me from the weight of having survived when better men like Tom did not. Asterisk. Asterisk, then a scarred dog appeared on my porch carrying Tom's boot, and everything changed. The dog stayed. I named him Buster, and slowly, through caring for him and through the presence of that shoe, I began to remember that surviving isn't just about breathing. It's about honoring the memory of those who didn't get to survive by actually living the years they lost. Asterisk. Asterisk, Tom told me once, during a particularly bad night, that if he didn't make it home, he wanted me to promise to build something good with whatever life I had left. Make it count, Johnny, he said. Make it mean something. I thought I had failed that promise. For 56 years, I thought I had failed him by just surviving without making anything count, without making it mean anything. Asterisk. Asterisk, but your letter helped me understand that I was measuring wrong. The good thing Tom wanted me to build wasn't a monument or a career or some grand gesture. It was exactly what I've started building these past 4 months. Connection with neighbors, honesty about my history, the courage to let people care about me, the willingness to care about them in return. It was opening my door when a scarred dog knocked. It was letting healing find its way in even when I'd given up believing healing was possible. Asterisk. Asterisk, the shoe sits on my shelf now, next to Ellen's photograph and my service medals and the flag from her funeral. I'd like to get a small plaque made for it. Tom's final march, a brother never forgotten. If that feels right to you. If it doesn't, I'll respect whatever you prefer. The shoe is Tom's, after all, and you're his widow. But it found its way to me, carried by a dog who seemed to understand what both of us needed. And I'd like to honor that journey if you'll allow me to. Asterisk. Asterisk, Clara, I would very much like to meet you, if you're willing. Not to dwell in grief, we've both done enough of that for several lifetimes. But to share memories of Tom, to talk about the boy from Ohio who could fix anything and believe the future would be kind. I think Tom would like knowing that his death eventually brought 2 lonely people together, that his memory became a bridge rather than a burden. Asterisk. Asterisk, there's a coffee shop in town called the Mill House. It's quiet, with good tea and better coffee, and the owner doesn't rush people who need time to talk. Would you meet me there? Perhaps next Saturday at 2 o'clock, if that works for you? I'll bring Buster, the dog who brought Tom back to both of us. I think you should meet him. I think Tom would want you to meet him. Asterisk. With deep gratitude and respect, John Ward. He read the letter twice, made one small correction where his handwriting had wavered, and carefully folded it into the envelope Margaret had provided. He would mail it tomorrow, but tonight he wanted to sit with the completion of it, with the sense that he had finally, after 56 years, found adequate words to say to the woman who had loved Tom Brennan and lost him to a war that took so much and gave back so little. The next morning, John walked to the post office with both dogs, the letter secured in his coat pocket. Mr. Martinez was there mailing Christmas packages to grandchildren scattered across the country, and they talked briefly about the snow, about the holidays approaching, about the small daily miracles that made December in a small town feel like participating in something larger than oneself. When John dropped the letter in the outgoing mail slot, he felt something shift. Not dramatically, but definitely. A door opening. A circle beginning to close. A story that had been paused for half a century starting to move again toward its proper resolution. Clara's response arrived 5 days later, her careful handwriting confirming that yes, Saturday at 2 o'clock would be perfect. And yes, she very much wanted to meet the dog who had accomplished the impossible. She mentioned that she had been afraid to reach out, worried that her letter might have been intrusive or unwelcome. John's response, she wrote, had given her something she hadn't felt in decades. The sense that Tom's memory was alive and honored, not just locked away in her private grief. Saturday arrived with bright winter sunshine, the kind of cold, clear day that makes everything look sharp-edged and newly defined. John dressed with care. Not the careful formality of trying to impress, but the respect of meeting someone who mattered. His Goodwill sweater, the one Sarah had sent him for his birthday 2 years ago that he'd barely worn. Clean jeans. His boots polished for the first time in memory. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and saw someone he barely recognized. Not the ghost who had haunted this house for 7 years, but a man present in his own life, preparing to meet another person with intention and hope. The Mill house was warm when they arrived, smelling of coffee and cinnamon and the particular comfort of a space designed for lingering. John chose a corner table with good light and enough privacy for conversation that might become emotional. Buster settled at his feet, calm and patient, as if understanding that this meeting required his best behavior. Clara arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, and John knew her immediately even though they'd never met. She was tall and slender, perhaps 75 years old, her silver hair cut short and practical, her face lined with years but her eyes bright and clear. She wore a blue wool coat and carried a leather bag that she clutched with both hands as she scanned the room, looking for someone she'd recognize only from a 56-year-old memory filtered through Tom's letters. John stood, his cane providing balance, and raised one hand in greeting. Recognition passed between them. Not of faces, since they'd never seen each other before, but of something deeper. Fellow survivors, fellow bearers of weight, fellow travelers on a path marked by loss and love and the long hard work of continuing anyway. "John," Clara said, and her voice carried both question and confirmation. "Clara," he replied. "Thank you for coming." She crossed to the table, set down her bag, and without hesitation reached for John's hand. She held it between both of hers, her grip firm and warm, and looked at him with eyes that had cried all their tears long ago but still held an ocean of feeling. "He wrote about you," she said. "He trusted you. He loved you the way soldiers love each other when they're fighting to keep each other alive. I've wanted to meet you for 56 years. I've wanted to meet you for just as long," John said, his throat tight. "I should have written. After he died, I should have found the words. I'm sorry I didn't." "You found them now," Clara said simply. "That's what matters." They sat, and Buster moved to position himself between them, resting his scarred head against Clara's knee with the gentle presumption of a dog who understands he's among friends. Clara looked down at him, her expression softening, and rested one hand on his head. "This is the messenger," she said softly. "This is the one who brought Tom home." "This is Buster," John confirmed. "He's been teaching me how to live again." They talked for 3 hours, ordering coffee and tea and pastries they barely touched, their words flowing with the ease of people who had been waiting decades for someone who would truly understand. Clara told stories of Tom before the war, his sense of humor, his skill with his hands, the way he approached every problem as if it was a puzzle that would yield to patience and creativity. John told stories of Tom during the war, his courage, his kindness, his absolute refusal to let despair win even when winning seemed impossible. They showed each other photographs. Clara had brought a small album. John had brought the image from her letter plus 2 others he'd found tucked into old papers after reading her letter, pictures he'd forgotten he had. They pieced together a fuller portrait of Tom Brennan, the boy from Ohio who had lived briefly but completely, who had loved well and fought bravely and died trying to keep his friends alive. "I'm getting a plaque made," John told her, "for the shoe. Tom's final march, a brother never forgotten. If you approve." Clara nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks unchecked. He'd like that. He'd like knowing his boots finally made it home, in a way, to someone who knew what they walked through. When they finally left the mill house, the winter sun was already beginning its descent toward evening. They stood on the sidewalk outside, Buster between them, and made plans to meet again. Next month. Perhaps for dinner. Perhaps John could come to Millbrook and see where Clara had built her life after loss. Perhaps she could come to his home and see Tom's shoe in its place of honor on the shelf. I'm glad Buster found you, Clara said, touching John's arm gently. I'm glad Tom found a way back to someone who would remember him properly. And I'm glad I found you too. It's not the same as having Tom back. But it's something. It's a kind of completion I didn't think was possible. It's healing, John said quietly. For both of us. They parted with a promise to call during the week, and John walked home with Buster at his side, his heart feeling fuller than it had in decades. The circle was closing. The weight was lifting. And Tom Brennan, who had died in jungle mud in 1968, was alive again in the shared memory of two people who had loved him and lost him and found a way to honor him together. That evening, John sat on his porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets with both dogs beside him and Clara's letter in his hand. He looked out at the neighborhood where lights were beginning to glow in windows, where families were gathering for dinner, where life continued its daily rhythms of ordinary beauty. He was part of that now, no longer watching from a distance, no longer isolated behind walls he'd built to protect himself from further pain. He was here, present, connected, alive. The brown shoe sat on its shelf inside, waiting for the plaque that would identify its significance. Tom's shoe, a brother's shoe, a memorial to sacrifice and a catalyst for healing and a reminder that the universe sometimes speaks in the most unexpected languages. Through scarred dogs and worn leather and the impossible journey of a boot from a jungle in 1968 to a porch in the present, arriving exactly when it needed to arrive, in exactly the pause that needed to carry it. John reached down and rested his hand on Buster's scarred head. You knew, he whispered. Somehow you knew exactly what we both needed. You brought Tom back, and you brought me back to life. That's more than I could have asked for. That's everything. Buster leaned into the touch, his eyes closing, his mission complete. And John sat on his weathered porch, no longer counting the days since Ellen's death or measuring his life in losses and absences. He was counting forward now, toward next Saturday's coffee with Clara, toward next month's dinner, toward the future that suddenly held possibility and connection, and the quiet joy of being part of the world again rather than separate from it. The smallest gesture, a dog, a shoe, a letter had changed everything. And John, at 78 years old with a body held together by pins and stubbornness and a heart that had learned to hope again, finally understood what Tom had meant all those years ago. Make it count. Make it mean something. Build something good. He was building it. Finally, after 56 years, he was building it. And it was enough.